Hi everyone, it's Erin from Taliesin Preservation. We are back again today with some pre-birthday videos in preparation to celebrate Frank Lloyd Wright's 153rd birthday coming up on June 8th. We're going to be talking today with Saskia Jorda and Ari Georges, both who have spent many years here at Taliesin, and they're going to be walking us through their art installations that they've done here as part of the birthday celebrations and crafting and figuring out how to craft our own in our own homes and making a more beautiful space as we celebrate Wright's life and legacy. So walk me through what that process looks like, creating something for Wright's birthday party, which is very special here at Taliesin. Were there any sort of predetermined themes or textures? What kind of inspired you guys to use these historic spaces to, amplify the birthday party?
Connection is that the spaces that were shared, especially the dining room, was something that was, in a way, like a canvas on which apprentices every week would paint a different story of how to arrange it. And mostly, though, it was the furniture and then the table settings and maybe flower arrangements.
Right.
This idea of taking the whole space and doing things with it is much, much more recent, and largely thanks to Saskia, I think, and the whole artist residency program that she helped spearhead, and that brought an energy of experimentation with the spaces that first it was the artists that were visiting, and then I think it bled to all of us residents, and we started wanting to do it ourselves.
Yes.
Right, Saskia?
Yeah, totally contagious. Yeah, well, for me, I was, after having an opportunity to live in the spaces and just have daily community experiences in there, it was always this kind of challenge, how to do something in spaces that are so rich and embedded with history and have so many beautiful architectural elements, and how to activate them in a different way, kind of recontextualizing them. So for like the two particular larger installations that I worked on with a lot of collaborative, energy, you asked about themes. So the first one that I shared was based on the one with the white hanging paper balls. That was kind of, for me, arriving in Wisconsin and seeing this explosion of blooms everywhere, because we were in the desert and we have very different blooming patterns here. So arriving in Wisconsin where it was so green and seeing the Taliesin gardens, starting to wake up and bloom. And so that piece was, the piece of the paper balls was really about this explosion of this early summer and a celebration of the Taliesin gardens, and in particular the peonies, which were usually incorporated or are usually incorporated in the birthday celebration in some way, whether at the table or decorating the cake. And so we wanted to make an abstraction of these blooms. And I worked with Ana Hernandez, who was also a fantastic artist and friend and dear member of the community. And her and I would work really well together in these crazy experiments. And so we decided to choose that as our module and replicate it multiple times and do something suspended. So the other thing is, like, how do you activate these spaces? And in one way we felt that, and like Aris, a lot of Aris installations, I think I feel the same way about his pieces, is that we chose to activate the upper half of the spaces because so much is happening in the bottom half. And also because the upper half, to me, is what connects all of the spaces together. The dining room is connected through that opening into the assembly hall, into the library. And so to me, it was a way of kind of bringing the energy from one room directly into the other, as opposed to looking at it as two different levels. So the paper balls were suspended from the peonies, I should say, were suspended from the ceiling and to just appear like they were magically floating up there. And then the following year was a little bit different. That was a collaboration with architect Tony Putnam, who was so fun and intense in his own way to work with. He designed, and I found his paper bird. Both of us worked. We talked about what are things that celebrate Taliesin life or that are important to Taliesin life, and migration is so central to to that, to the way that it functions, right? And it's so important. It happens twice a year. It's this big deal. And so we decided to use the bird as our icon or our module that kind of spoke of that experience of migration. And so together we designed this paper bird that then we created a file and laser cut and, made hundreds of them that could be suspended again from the spaces, and this time connecting the dining room, the assembly hall, and the library, and the entry points. So there were birds everywhere. There were birds in the bathroom. There were birds in people's heads. There were birds coming out of the floral arrangements. And every time I would cut a session of birds, Tony would come and say, "We need more. We need more." And Ari, your overhead installations, I think, had a similar spirit, right? Where they were
and
activating that top half.
Mine root back to when I was still apprentice in the late 80s, I think, when Bill Moss came to Arizona to do these workshops, and he was the father of the modern tent, and the tent that has flexible poles that go in it and has interesting shapes. He more or less invented that, and it's actually in the permanent exhibit at the MoMA. Of industrial design, American industrial design. But he somehow, at the end of his career, he had created a company that was very successful. He did mountaineering tents that were very high-end, and moss tents from Minneapolis. And then he came to Scottsdale, and I guess he met with Stephen Nemtin, and at some point he came out to meet the community, and he taught us how to do these stretched little pieces of fabric. And first we did a series of little installations on the ground outside of the studio on the grass in Arizona. And it was just about everybody. Everybody was whole afternoon doing this little tiny, almost like a model of how to stretch these fabrics and understand the principles behind how you create the curvatures. And when it's freestanding, you obviously have to have some kind of anchor points on which to pull, so you need little poles or sticks or whatever. Then we went in the pavilion and we started doing pieces in space anchored to the architecture. And that, of course, presents its own challenge, because something like the pavilion, which was a building that was rebuilt in the 60s after the fire, with steel, it's pretty strong, so you can pull on it with a piece of fabric. But move to this dining room in Wisconsin, where it's all delicate and wood, then suddenly you have a different armature, so to speak. And so I was using, for example, softer fabrics that stretch easier and they don't require too much tension on the wall or on a piece of trim, so that it doesn't come flying off during dinner. My first one inside at Taliesin, Hillside, was in the studio during a box project celebration, and it was by the fireplace. Okay, so Saskia, being an artist, I'm primarily trained architect. An artist's mind and an artist's heart is fearless, and they don't necessarily are going to hesitate too much with too much reverence for, let's say, a building. If anything, they invite the building to come into their world and, play with them. I had a hard time just with the idea of adding these new shapes into the space, almost like being a hubris to the space. It's like you're trying not to insult the architecture that's there, and so, but at the same time, you got to find the balance between looking ridiculously timid, and then it's like, who wants it? Might as well not do anything. A beautiful flower arrangement is more powerful than a, self-conscious installation up above your head. So it was a little tricky. I had to cut for the dining room. I had to cut special pieces because there was so little space between. The proportions of the space, the pendants of the lights, and whatever was left. You couldn't come in with an existing shape and try to make it work. So I had to cut new shapes to fit between them. And in a sense, it was more like an installation of smaller pieces that combined together.
So we know that coming to Taliesin or Hillside is this really sensory, visceral experience, and we get a lot of reaction from folks who visit us. Did your work have that same impact on those guests, and what was the reception of your? How did the guests perceive your work? And
it is a point of a little bit of for me, it was a point of worry. Like, in other words, is somebody expecting to experience Frank Lloyd Wright, and suddenly I kind of interfere, and well, I mean, because sometimes, I mean, back then when we did these dinners for the birthday, some of those guests, that was their first time there, and who knows if it would have been the last two, you know, and if there was one chance to experience that space, suddenly it's not quite the pure architecture that was planned originally. At the same time, I think where I would find consolation, by and large, I've never heard anybody ever not liking what they were seeing, and especially, as I said, you know, seeing the explosion overhead of something other than what's on the table, because what's on the table is in itself very creative and very interesting, because there's entire teams that work on those things,
right,
down to the place card and how the name is of the person presented. Not, you know, graphics. I mean, there's a lot going on. So I think I think the overhead kind of complements the spirit of creativity and designing the event. And when people realize it's all done by the residents, the students, faculty, visiting artists, then it begins to paint a picture of a very alive place, you know, a place that is continuing to be creative in the same spaces where Wright was creative and the fellowship was creative. And I think that that leaves a good impression, that makes you feel like, okay, this is somebody creating a reality to which they invite us. They're not just setting it up for us to be impressed. We're joining their world. It's authentic. It's fun. It's contemporary. It's not afraid. You know, there's so many subtle messages that I think come across. So I think by and large, it's received well.
So how would you suggest that people do this in their own homes?
Well, I would say the first thing is we should identify or could identify a space in their home that they would like to commit to activating in some way. You know, whether it's the ceiling, a corner, the hallway, over the table, an entryway, a chair, whatever scale. I think deciding what space first and creating sort of a focus area rather than spreading it throughout like a whole house, like a little piece there. I think this kind of joy of abundance and like creating a focal point is usually stronger. In my case, I usually choose a module that I repeat multiple times. So like the bird or the paper ball or something. That's a kind of an accessible way of entering installation art or the realm of installation art.
If you're frightened by the whole creative process, I mean, some people have convinced themselves that they're not creative. I don't know how they do that, but and then, because I believe that everybody's born creative. Look at how children are everywhere, no matter where you're born. For the first few months, at least, of your life, you're super creative, and you don't even care what everybody thinks. So we all come from that. So one way or another, we've been there. And so, but if you are frightened with the idea of creating something that, especially if you're going to share the Frank Lloyd Wright birthday, my goodness, what a tall order. A suggestion would be something like in the origami art, which is such a fulfilling way of making something with instructions, and you can choose how complicated to make it. It kind of goes well with the idea of flower arrangements, which is another Japanese art, the ikebana. And both of those are connections to Taliesin and Wright's affinity for the Japanese culture and art. But an origami is interesting because it is an instant gratification without it being too intimidating on one hand. I mean, of course, you're not going to make a very complicated one, but even just the simple balloon, you know, the box can be very fulfilling. And so imagine having a clear ball full of, you know, origami you made, or that's sitting there instead of your flower arrangement,
Ari, I love your idea of the origami because that's really accessible and can be done with
what I thought.
all kinds of paper, repurposed paper, whatever. But if that's also intimidating, I often find that another point of entry could be working with a found object or a series of found objects that you react to create that repetition, or perhaps is wrapping something like an object, or you know, I was just thinking, well, what do people have at home that could be used? Like, say you have a stash of paper cups, could those be arranged to create some sort of you know, piece? Or maybe it's a stack of chairs, or maybe it's toilet paper rolls, or whatever it is that could be as a multiple that could be the found object that could be celebrated with very simple materials. It doesn't have to be, oh, let's find the most expensive materials, and you don't even have to go out. Sometimes just looking inside your house, you know, and rearranging something could create an installation. Toys are a great. You know, blocks, wooden blocks. There's so many things that we probably have sitting at home that could work for a, you know, celebration piece.